Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital for another week with all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw from the Czech News Studios in Victoria. Thank you so much for being here, whether you're watching us on Sundays on Czech or on the YouTubings, or you're connected via the pod feed directly into your ear holes. We appreciate you staying with us each and every week and subscribing and listening to everything we have to say about BC politics. And we've got a great show for you this week. The original Pod Squad is back, version 1, no substitutes, no fill-ins. We have the original crew, Katy Merrifield, Vice President of Wellington Advocacy, a political strategist. Hello, Katy. Thank you for being here again.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Jillian Oliver, BC Green Strategist Extraordinaire. I added the extraordinaire. I always add the extraordinaire for you, Jillian.
Yeah, it would be hard if you took it away now. Thanks for
right.
having me back.
Maclean K, editor of the Orca.ca. Hello, Maclean.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having us on.
All right. We have avoided, mercifully, talking about COVID-19 for a couple weeks now, like maybe 2-3 weeks. It's been spectacular. I've enjoyed every minute of it. That ends now because we have to bring the COVID train back into the station here, and it had dominated this week in BC politics. So let's just go into it. We have good news. Pretty high vaccination rates, 81%, first dose, 64%, second dose. We're on track for a pretty good rate. We have a new Vaxxed to the Max campaign, which is god-awful. But nonetheless, that is the slogan. We got new mobile clinics going out to try and reach people, so that's good. Bad news, we have case counts rising again. We have the central Okanagan declared as an outbreak zone with special restrictions on masks and travel restrictions there. So put all this together. Where are we at? Is it good or bad? How are we feeling about it? Does the government seem like it's doing a good job? Adrian Dix is back on our TV screens multiple times a week. Dr. Henry is doing her press conferences again. How do we put all of this into perspective? Katy, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, first and foremost, daily case counts are basically irrelevant. We know what matters is hospitalizations, ICUs, and deaths. On the regional restrictions that have been imposed in the Okanagan, I find that a little bit interesting. They were, despite like repeated calls by the opposition for regional restrictions throughout this pandemic, they were dismissed as futile the entire time. Surrey was one of the hardest hit regions for COVID for much of the past 18 months, but no regional considerations were imposed there. You may be asking why that is. And, in my view, it's because Surrey is electorally significant for the NDP, whereas in the Okanagan, they only have 2 seats, Vernon and Boundary Similkameen. So it's not entirely surprising from like a political partisan perspective that they felt imposing regional restrictions would be essentially a free pass for them at this point. On the Vax to the Max campaign, look, I don't care how much is spent on awareness campaigns. I don't care what the slogans are. I don't care how many incentives government dreams up. I'm even in favor of like creative approaches to threats. Let's just keep getting people vaccinated. This is our best and basically only line of defense against this pandemic. So for me, whatever it takes.
Yeah, no matter how cringeworthy the slogan.
Yes.
Vaccine to the extreme and various other Poochie the dog references. It's an interesting point about the regional restrictions, and I agree. It's different than what we have been doing during the campaign so far. But when Dr. Monty Henry was asked that question, she said the difference now is we have enough vaccine, before we didn't, that we can hit regional areas and try to lower the vaccine. One of the things in the central Okanagan is shortening the distance between first and second dose to get people vaccinated. I don't know if that makes a difference in the way you kind of view it. Maclean, how do you put all this together?
I mean, it's good that they're reacting now, but if you read, and listen to people from the interior and the north, they're telling you it's not just as simple as, vaccine hesitancy and the anti-vax movement. There's an element of that, yes. There's an element of that here in Victoria. But I mean, this outbreak is concentrated among, millennials essentially in the Okanagan, which the restrictions on distancing and masks were lifted before most of these people were even eligible to be fully vaccinated. So it's almost kind of unfair that the people that are most likely to be working in high contact jobs in the service industry and places like that were those in the Okanagan who were very last in line to receive even eligibility to be vaccinated. And in fact, in the interior, vaccination campaign started a couple weeks after, here in the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. And so from their point of view, it's, everyone's looking at the Okanagan and pointing fingers and saying, what are you guys doing wrong? They're not doing anything wrong. They were being held to the same timeline as the rest of BC when they were much further behind on vaccination through no fault of their own.
Yeah. I mean, those damn youths, what with their not trying, get off my lawn, all that sort of stuff. We
Don't
created,
blow it for the rest of us.
That's right. We created a vaccination system that put them last. And so is it any surprise that the outbreaks that are going to occur as we enter this kind of final stage of our vaccination are younger people? I agree with the point. It seems a little unfair. But Jillian, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that young people have gotten a raw deal throughout COVID. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that sort of shifts political consciousness as we move through the pandemic. So much blame being thrown around when youth were having to sacrifice to really keep other people safe largely. So yeah, I think we should avoid blaming young people at this point for sure. But I think, we're seeing a shift in the government strategy now that vaccinations are available. They're sort of, now that they're shifting to more of like a personal responsibility model, I think, so sort of only going as far as they really have to keep those hospitalization numbers down, and then trying to, give as much carrot as they can to encourage people to get vaccinated that have been putting it off, or, just haven't had a time to do it yet. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how those incentives develop, and also how those sort of restrictions develop as we try to get those numbers up, and how low the vaccine hesitancy really is.
Mm-hmm. The carrot and stick question we'll come back to later in the show as a hot take, because there are some different ways that other countries are incentivizing people to get vaccinated. We seem to have done a pretty good job here based on basically nothing. We're not giving anyone anything other than the vaccine, and we're on track for the 80% range, which could be pretty good. So let's move on to an actual political topic this week, which is public accounts coming out. Now, for those of you who don't follow government finances, and God help you if you do, it takes a long time to close the books on the previous year. So what we got this week was the end of the year that started with the budget in February before COVID even happened in 2020. That's the budget we're closing off as of March 31st of this year. And it produced a $5.5 billion deficit, which sounds pretty bad. It's much worse than the $227 million surplus we thought we were going to get before COVID, but it's better than the $13 billion deficit we thought we were going to run at the peak of COVID. So there's lots of different ways into this, I guess, and whether we care. It is an extraordinary year, and we spent money to save people. Is there any problem with the deficit being what it is at the end of the year, and do the numbers mean anything, I guess, is kind of a starting way into that. Maclean, what do you think?
I mean, yes, there's ordinary. If you traveled back in time 5 years ago and said, the NDP at this point of their mandate will be running a deficit of 5.5 billion, a lot of people's heads would explode.
Yeah, that's not what I'd do with a time machine, by the way, if I had one. No, 5 years ago to make a political point. But
the lamest possible use of a time machine. You're right. Yeah. But everything changed last year. And so there are people looking at, 5.5 billion. It could have been 5.5 billion. And, what's really the difference? Well, the difference is 3 billion. And I would argue that the point from here on in is not to, wring our hands about the money that was spent last year, but a plan to climb out, a plan to get back to at least something resembling a balanced budget or a surplus. And so I think that's where the pressure is going to be from now on. I don't think people are going to be looking at the deficit and saying, oh my God, we all knew this was going to happen. And most people would say, for the most part, it was money well spent. But where we go from here is much more important.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to craft a plan to get out of something that when you're still in the middle of it, who knows what the next step will be on COVID. But assuming we're done with it, then yes, obviously. And one of the questions to the finance minister was, how many more deficits are we running? The answer was maybe 3, who knows? It's even worse in Ottawa. I don't know if you guys saw the parliamentary budget officer's report that if Ottawa doesn't change its fiscal strategy, that they don't achieve balanced budgets again until 2070, which is insane and never going to happen. But still, you look at the fiscal kind of change that's caused by COVID. Jillian, how do you kind of view all these numbers and where we're at?
Well, yeah, I think that it makes sense that they don't have all the answers right now. We have no idea what the global economy is going to look like after COVID. BC's economy is dependent on tourism, on trade, on a lot of things that are, still very much up in the air. Two things kind of stood out to me specifically from the public accounts. One is how much. The lower than expected deficit was buoyed by one-time federal transfers, which are one time, they're not going to happen again. I think the flip side of that, though, is that the federal government is showing a lot of willingness to step up and pay for services like childcare and infrastructure. So, on the other hand, maybe that'll be mitigated a little bit. I think the other thing that, which I've talked about before, is how dependent our budget and our economy is on the housing market. One of the reasons why the deficit is lower than expected is because there's just been so much property transfer and property transfer tax resulting out of that, as well as, of course, all of the adjacent industries that real estate brings in, and that is maybe good for the budget and the bottom line, but it's not necessarily good for the economy in terms of how a lot of people experience it. It exacerbates inequality. It makes life less affordable for people. So it's, I think that's kind of like a fine point on the sort of good news aspect of this headline, is that, that number doesn't really tell the full story of how this is really affecting British Columbians.
Yeah, great point on housing. For government that promised to do more on housing affordability, to continue to see prices go up and then government reap the rewards of that in its budget, which it then needs to balance, is a problem not only this government had, but the previous government had. And then just to add, there was one other element that helped the budget, which was ICBC, which turned from a dumpster fire overnight into a pot of gold, apparently, $1.5 billion of revenue from this new no-fault system and fewer crashes. And so those three things, Ottawa and housing and ICBC, lifted this up into a better result than it could have been. Katie, what do you think?
I want to talk about the importance of getting back to balance. Like, to a degree, government spending was very necessary during the pandemic. We had to keep the economy functioning, make sure people were okay. Governments of all partisan stripes across this country went into further deficits to help keep folks afloat, and I understand that. But we need a plan to get back to balance as soon as possible. And in my view, the reason for that is debt servicing costs are very, very expensive. Every dollar that taxpayers send to European bankers to service interest costs, like, that's a dollar that could go to healthcare, education, and infrastructure spending. So I think strategically the NDP are putting themselves in a bit of a bind by saying that they're not going to have this plan until budget 2022. Like, that's almost a year from now. That's a significant gap of time for the opposition to capitalize on a narrative of fiscal incompetence, which, as we know, stemming from years past in previous NDP administrations, like, that's a big vulnerability for them. So I think it would be smarter politically for them to come out with a plan prior to budget, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, debt is an issue, but it's hard because voters don't seem to. The numbers are so large that what do they mean, kind of thing. And but as interest rates rise, 2 credit down ratings on the government, which I kind of think are unfair a little bit. But the argument from the finance minister is we spend 3 cents on every dollar of revenue government comes in on servicing debt, and it's still fairly affordable for now, I guess. But yeah, debt is a persistent issue, and deficits are a risk for the government for sure. So we will see how that plays out. I imagine it's going to be a familiar theme throughout the year. How do we get back to balance? Let's move on to a little bit of federal politics, and it is not about the BC or the federal Greens for once. How many weeks did we just kill off talking about the implosion of the federal Greens, which, by the way, continue to still implode? I think the latest is they're burning cash. No, see, now I'm doing it. Now I'm talking about the Greens. Not going to do it. Not going to talk about the Greens. This is about the federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh urging the Governor General to not grant Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's early request for an election, which he hasn't made yet, but saying that we have a fixed election calendar and that I'm starting to laugh as I even say this out loud because there's a lot of hypocrisy built in here, but a fixed election calendar, and we should just wait until the next election comes because this minority government is doing well, which may ring a lot of familiar bells for BC politics watchers who've been through this before. Maclean, what do you think?
I mean, this exact same thing happened last year during the provincial election campaign, where, if you recall, there were also concurrent rumors that the federal Liberals were angling to force an election, and of course they seem to be doing that now. But at that time, as he was campaigning, Jagmeet Singh in BC, and repeating all the NDP's lines about, well, we need this for stability and et cetera and so forth, but at the same time in Ottawa saying, if the prime minister was to trigger an early election, that would be selfish. And during a pandemic, I mean, my goodness, can you think of such a terrible? Can you even consider doing such a terrible thing? It's kind of amusing that it happened then, and it's even more amusing that it's going to happen now. And the fact that people just sort of brush off this blatant and staggering hypocrisy is a little depressing, to be honest.
Yeah, well, it's politics. People are,
Yeah.
like they're just hoping that nobody notices, I guess, Jillian. The idea that a governor general, or in BC's case, the lieutenant governor in 2017 and in 2020 would somehow not grant a premier's or prime minister's request for an election when, enough time has passed. And it depends on the scenario, I guess. But federally now, what do you think of this idea that somehow this all gets blocked?
I think Jagmeet Singh knows what he's doing, which is sending a really strong signal to the public that he's not to blame for a snap election. You saw when the prime minister was asked about this in a press conference that he went on to immediately blame the NDP for not helping them implement their agenda. And yeah, I think that Trudeau should actually be really careful about that, because in our experience in BC, I ran the BC Green campaign. Like, every time that Horgan would bring us up in a press conference or try to blame the Greens, I was like laughing, because all it did was just sort of turn Sonia Furstenau into a martyr, like it, and kind of put the spotlight on us, and engender more sympathy in the public for our plight. So Jagmeet Singh is very popular. He's more popular than the prime minister, and I think that Trudeau should, focus on a clear message, which is just the need for a mandate. I think that's what Horgan should have done, and I don't think he did himself any favors with the messaging there. So yeah.
It is a fascinating parallel to the 2020 election here. This idea that suddenly you go from a working minority government to, which is, on one day doing whatever you need it to be done. You got the votes to pass your budget or your initiative, to the next day saying it just doesn't work. There's procedural games, there's problems, voters deserve a stable government that can get them through these difficult times. And then you jump that argument out to the public. And it's worked in a lot of cases, despite the fact it isn't actually true. If you watch Parliament or you watch the legislature, it wasn't true that suddenly it didn't work all of a sudden. It was working. It was working perfectly fine. I don't know what anyone wants to jump in on that point. There is a disconnect there, but it doesn't seem to register with maybe voters aren't even watching to see what's working and what isn't working. Maclean?
The only thing that's working is in both cases, the governing parties were looking at the polls and thinking that a majority government, which is another 4 years of doing whatever they want, was at the very least within reach. If in both cases with John Horgan and Justin Trudeau, if they were looking at polls saying, "Ooh, it's dicey, it's risky," then they would be saying the exact opposite. This is a stable situation. There's no need to go to the polls. The people need us to govern as long as we can in the name of stability. And so that's what this is about. Both John Horgan and Justin Trudeau looked at the polls and saw the possibility of 4 years of majority government. And in John Horgan's case, he turned out to be right.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else think that? I mean, it seems the consensus is yes. There's no way the Governor General is going to say no to this thing. We are in an election, looks like by September, somewhere, October, somewhere around there, and then that's just the way it's happening. Does that seem to be the consensus on where we're going?
Yeah, like the Governor General is not going to listen to the leader of the third party. His opinion doesn't matter. This is definitely going to proceed. I agree with Jillian wholeheartedly, though, on why Singh did this. It was to send a message to the public so he can claim moral high ground 100%. I also think that there's, I don't know if the NDP, despite rising popularity, despite Jagmeet Singh being a formidable campaigner, they don't have as much money as their opponents, right? Like on average, there was an analysis done on riding associations across the country. The Conservatives have about $61,000 in assets per riding association. The Liberals have about 36,000, and the NDP are at 7. So I can understand there's a financial reason that they might not be super excited to head into this early election.
You know who else doesn't have a lot of money? Federal Greens. Did it again.
Yeah.
Did it again. Damn those Greens. So tempting to kick them while they're down, but nonetheless. Okay, let's move on to our hot take here. We'll go around the table very quickly, but in the United States, President Joe Biden has called on American states to offer $100 incentives to the newly vaccinated to try and get people out there who haven't been vaccinated to get the jab. In British Columbia, a health minister has been insistent, we're not doing that. We're not offering lottery incentives. And he highlighted not allowing chocolate or bourbon to be an incentive either, which is a delicious incentive that is now off the table. So do we think this is a good idea in the U.S., and do we think BC should consider in any way following suit? Jillian?
Yeah, I think if it works, we should try it, especially for young people who, like I said before, are doing this to protect other people. Why not, sweeten the deal for them, even if it's not chocolate?
Yeah, this cash seems to be the most likely way. No one else, or a voucher or something like that, I would guess. But Katie?
As I said, I am in favor of anything that boosts vaccination rates. So sure, bring it on.
Yeah. Maclean?
I love how a lottery in Alberta is, thuggish and Neanderthal-like, but straight up giving cash to people to be vaccinated is enlightened public policy. I think both are good. I think anything we can do that to entice the heretofore unvaccinated to get their shots is a good thing, and if that's what works, that's fine.
Well, I guess the question though is if we offer, and you already see this in the States, if we offer new people $100 to get vaccinated, well, why doesn't everyone get $100 who already was vaccinated? And does that raise a political problem of unfairness? And I don't know, but I kind of agree. I think it would make a lot of sense if we, especially when we have a Crown Lottery Corporation here, which just makes a ton of money every year, and maybe not in the last year with casinos closed, but if it's there and a Crown Lottery Corp, why can't we have a lottery or a winnings or something? There's got to be some way that we can pull that off. But I think this is one of those issues where the health minister has made a decision, and he doesn't want to move on it, and we're not doing it. So I would put myself down as I think it's a good idea, and I think we should do it if it helps. Why not? There's really no downside other than it adds to the gigantic deficit that most people don't pay any attention to right now anyway. So, all right, excellent. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching. Stick around for more on the audio podcast. We've got more content for you. We're taking a bit of a break here. We will be back later in August after a couple of weeks, so make sure you subscribe, and you'll get the ding in your pod box letting you know that we are back in your ears. Thanks so much for watching. We will see you next time on Political Capital.